Hey man, leave. Nobody knows you here.
The gate had not changed in 10 years, but the man standing in front of it had changed in every way a person could change. He sat low in a wheelchair, the wheels caked with dust from a road he had walked for miles before his legs gave out. His jacket was stained, torn at one shoulder, the kind of coat a person wears when they no longer have the luxury of choosing what to wear. Behind him, beyond the iron gate, sat a house he had once called home, its windows glowing with warm light and the sound of laughter drifting faintly into the evening air. The security guard studied him for a long moment, unmoved, unimpressed, already reaching for his radio. "Sir, this is private property. You need to leave." The man in the wheelchair said nothing. He simply looked past the guard, toward the house, toward the family who did not yet know he was still alive. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Nobody at that gate that evening had any reason to believe the man in the wheelchair was anything more than a stranger looking for charity. He did not argue with the guard. He did not raise his voice or demand to be let inside. He simply turned his chair around and wheeled himself back down the long gravel driveway, disappearing into the dark the same way he had arrived, quietly and without a fight. But 3 miles away, in a banquet hall already strung with white lights and fresh flowers, an envelope sat on a table near the entrance, addressed to a wedding neither the bride nor the groom's family expected to be disrupted. The name written across the front of that envelope belonged to a man everyone in that house believed had died 2 years earlier, in a country most of them could not find on a map. That name was Ethan Whitmore, and somebody, that same night, tore his invitation in half. To understand why a decorated soldier would return home and choose to hide who he was, you first have to understand who Ethan Whitmore used to be before the world found a way to profit from his absence. Ethan grew up in a modest 2-story house on the edge of a small Ohio town, the oldest son of Robert Whitmore, a hard-working contractor who built his company from nothing but a truck, a toolbox, and a stubborn refusal to quit. In those early years, Robert and Ethan were inseparable. Robert taught his son how to read blueprints before he learned how to ride a bike. He taught him how to shake a man's hand like he meant it, how to keep his word even when it cost him money, and how to treat every employee on a job site with the same respect he would want for himself. Ethan idolized his father, and for a long time, his father gave him every reason to. Ethan was not the only child in the Whitmore household, and for most of his childhood, that never seemed to matter. His younger brother Mark was quieter, more reserved, more comfortable behind a desk with numbers than out in the field with a hammer in his hand. Where Ethan built things with his hands, Mark built things with spreadsheets, quietly learning the financial side of his father's growing business, while Ethan learned the physical one. Robert loved both of his sons, but even Diane, their mother, could sense the difference in how Robert spoke about each of them at the dinner table. Ethan was the one Robert bragged about to his crew. Mark was the one Robert trusted with the books. For years, the two brothers found a kind of balance in that difference, each carving out his own space in a family that, on the surface, looked like it was building something that would last. It was during Ethan's second year working alongside his father that he met Sarah Bennett, a schoolteacher who had recently moved into town to be closer to her aging parents. Their relationship did not begin with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It began the way most lasting things begin, quietly, over coffee after church, over long phone calls that stretched past midnight, over the slow realization that neither of them wanted the conversation to end. Sarah was steady, in a way that grounded Ethan, and Ethan was warm, in a way that made Sarah feel safe for the first time in years. When Ethan finally proposed, kneeling in the same park where they had their first real conversation, Sarah did not hesitate for even a second. Robert cried at the engagement dinner, something none of his children had ever seen him do before. Diane called it the happiest night of her life. Even Mark, for one evening, seemed genuinely glad for his brother. But happiness in that household did not last as long as everyone hoped it would, because success has a way of quietly rearranging the people closest to it. Robert's construction company had grown far beyond anything he originally imagined, landing contracts with developers 3 counties over, doubling its workforce in under 2 years. And as the business grew, so did the value Robert placed on Mark's role within it. Mark had spent years mastering the financial architecture that now kept the company afloat, and Robert began introducing him to clients not as his son, but as his right hand. Ethan did not resent this shift at first. He was proud of his brother, proud of how far the company had come. But Mark noticed something Ethan did not, that no matter how much responsibility he took on, his father's crew still spoke of Ethan first when they talked about who would one day take over everything Robert had built. When Ethan's unit was called up for one last deployment before his contract with the army was set to end, the news landed on the Whitmore family like a held breath nobody wanted to release. Robert did not try to talk him out of it, though everyone in the room could see how badly he wanted to. Instead, he gripped his son's shoulder the way he used to when Ethan was young, and told him the company, the house, the family, all of it would be waiting for him exactly as he left it. Sarah promised to write every single week. Diane made him promise to call whenever he could. Even Mark, standing quietly near the doorway, told his brother to come home in one piece, and for a brief moment, the old closeness between them seemed to flicker back to life. Nobody in that room that night could have imagined how differently things would look by the time Ethan tried to walk back through their front door. For the first few months of deployment, letters from Ethan arrived on schedule, filled with small details meant to reassure the people waiting for him back home. He wrote about the heat, the food, the friendships he was building with the men in his unit, careful never to mention anything that might worry his mother. Sarah kept every letter in a wooden box beside her bed. Reading them so many times the paper began to soften at the folds. Then, without warning, the letters stopped. Weeks passed with no word, then a month, then 2. Robert made calls to contacts he barely knew, trying to find someone who could tell him anything. Diane stopped sleeping through the night. Sarah checked the mailbox every single day, even on Sundays, even when she knew there would be nothing inside. When the official notice finally arrived, it did not confirm what they feared. It only confirmed that Ethan was missing, and that no one could say for certain what had happened to him. Grief, in the Whitmore household, did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, reshaping the family in ways nobody fully noticed until much later. Robert buried himself in work, taking on larger contracts than ever before, as though enough movement might keep him from having to sit still with his fear. Mark stepped into the space his brother had left behind, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Someone had to keep the company running while Robert's attention was elsewhere. But necessity has a way of becoming comfort, and comfort has a way of becoming permanence. Within a year, clients who once asked for Ethan by name were shaking Mark's hand instead. New contracts bore his signature. New hires were told the company belonged to Robert Whitmore and his son Mark, with no mention of the brother, who was still, as far as anyone officially knew, simply missing rather than gone. Sarah did not adjust to the silence as easily as the rest of the family seemed to. She continued teaching, continued attending church with the Whitmores every Sunday, continued wearing the ring Ethan had given her, even as the months stretched into a year and a half with no news. Her father, James Bennett, watched his daughter's grief with a different kind of concern, one rooted less in sympathy and more in practicality. James had never fully approved of Sarah marrying into a family whose fortune depended on a construction business rather than something he considered more stable. When a business associate of Robert's, a man named Daniel Price, began showing quiet interest in Sarah, James did not discourage it. He simply mentioned Daniel's name a little more often at dinner, reminded Sarah a little more frequently, that grief should not mean putting her entire life on hold, that Ethan, wherever he was, would not want her to stop living. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Ethan was alive. Injured in an ambush that killed 2 men in his unit, he had spent months in a military hospital overseas, unable to communicate, his identification lost in the chaos of the attack that nearly ended his life. By the time he was well enough to write, he composed a single letter, slow and careful, addressed to Sarah, explaining everything: the ambush, the recovery, his desperate hope that she had waited. That letter made its way across an ocean and arrived at the Whitmore residence on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, placed on the kitchen counter along with the rest of the mail. Mark was the one who found it first. He read his brother's handwriting on the envelope, sat with it in his hands for a long time in the quiet of the empty kitchen, and then, instead of walking it upstairs to Sarah, he folded it closed and slid it into the bottom drawer of his office desk. Mark would spend a long time afterward trying to explain that decision to himself, though he never quite managed to make it sound reasonable, even in his own head. He told himself he was protecting the company during a fragile stretch of growth, that news of Ethan resurfacing, injured and uncertain, might unravel contracts that depended on stability. He told himself he would show Sarah the letter eventually, once the timing felt right, once he had a better sense of what Ethan's return might mean for everyone involved. But weeks passed, then months, and the letter stayed exactly where he had hidden it, buried beneath old invoices and outdated paperwork. Meanwhile, Sarah's grief slowly softened into something quieter, something that made room, for the first time, for Daniel Price to sit beside her at dinner, for her father to smile a little wider, for a version of her future that no longer included the man writing to her from a hospital bed 6,000 miles away. It took Ethan the better part of a year to recover enough strength to travel, his body rebuilt slowly through months of surgery and rehabilitation in a hospital that smelled permanently of antiseptic and old coffee. He wrote to Sarah only that one time, certain in his heart that his letter had reached her, certain that somewhere back in Ohio she was waiting the way she had promised. What he could not have known was that his words never made it past his own brother's desk drawer, that the silence he assumed was distance and slow mail was, in truth, something far more deliberate. When Ethan was finally cleared to fly home, the army offered to notify his family directly, to arrange a proper homecoming, with cameras and flags, and the kind of reunion families dream about. Ethan declined. Something in him, some instinct sharpened by months of uncertainty, told him to see his family exactly as they were before announcing that he was still among the living. Ethan's plan might have fallen apart entirely if not for Daniel Reyes, a man who had served beside him overseas and who, by strange coincidence, had taken a job maintaining the grounds of a large private estate not far from the Whitmore family's own property. When Ethan reached out to him, quietly, uncertain of what he would even say, Daniel did not ask many questions. He simply told Ethan to come stay with him for a while. No explanations required, no timeline demanded. It was Daniel who first suggested, half joking, that Ethan could pass through town completely unnoticed given how much he had changed, the weight he had lost, the beard he had grown, the wheelchair he now depended on for long distances. What began as an offhand comment slowly became something Ethan could not stop thinking about. If his own family did not recognize him, what would that tell him about the 2 years he had been gone? Ethan told himself, at first, that he only wanted to see his father's face from a distance, just once, before revealing himself properly. He told himself he only wanted to know that Sarah was safe, that his mother was well, that the company his father had spent decades building was still standing strong. But standing outside that familiar gate for the first time in 2 years, watching lights glow warmly behind windows he used to walk past without a second thought, something in Ethan hesitated. He did not walk up and announce himself. He did not call out his father's name. Instead, he watched and waited and let the security guard, a man he did not recognize, mistake him for exactly what he appeared to be, a stranger in a wheelchair with nowhere else to go. It was not cowardice that kept him silent that night. It was the quiet, aching need to understand what kind of family he was about to return to. The guard at the gate that evening had no way of knowing the man in front of him had once played basketball in the driveway just beyond the fence, had once carried groceries through that same entrance every Sunday after church. To him, Ethan was simply a stranger asking for something the estate was not in the business of giving. "I'm sorry, sir, I can't let you through without authorization," the guard said, already reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder. Ethan did not argue. He had not expected to be recognized, not really, but some quiet part of him had hoped for it anyway, had hoped some flicker of familiarity might cross the guard's face and end this before it truly began. It did not happen. Ethan simply nodded, thanked the man for his time, and wheeled himself back down the long gravel road, disappearing into the dark exactly the way he had arrived, unnoticed and unclaimed by the family sleeping soundly behind that gate. Daniel found Ethan sitting outside his apartment an hour later, still in the same stained jacket, staring at nothing in particular. Neither of them said much at first. Daniel simply sat down beside him, handed him a cup of coffee, and waited until Ethan was ready to talk. When Ethan finally explained what he wanted to do, not to announce himself, not yet, but to find some way onto the property itself, to see his family up close before deciding what came next, Daniel did not try to talk him out of it. Instead, he mentioned that the estate was short-handed on groundskeeping staff ahead of an upcoming event, and that the family rarely looked twice at day laborers hired through outside contractors. It would not be difficult, Daniel explained, for a quiet, unassuming man in a wheelchair to be brought on for light maintenance work, especially if nobody had any reason to look closely at his face. 3 days later, Ethan returned to the same property, this time through a service entrance reserved for hired help, wearing a contractor's vest and pushing a cart of gardening tools instead of arriving on his own. Nobody at the gate stopped him this time. Nobody asked his name beyond the one written on Daniel's paperwork, a name that was not his own. As he moved through the grounds for the first time in 2 years, Ethan found himself studying every detail with a strange, aching hunger. The flower beds his mother once tended herself, now maintained by hired staff. New landscaping near the west wing that had not existed before he left. A company logo stitched into the uniforms of workers he did not recognize, bearing his brother's name alongside his father's. Everything familiar had been quietly rearranged in his absence, and Ethan could not yet tell whether that rearrangement had happened out of necessity or out of something else entirely. It was Mark who Ethan saw first, stepping out onto the back terrace with a phone pressed to his ear, discussing a contract deadline in the same confident tone their father used to use. For a moment, Ethan simply stood frozen near the hedges, watching his younger brother move through the space with an ease that had not existed 2 years earlier, an ease that suggested this had become entirely his world now. Mark glanced toward the grounds crew only once, his eyes sweeping briefly over Ethan without a flicker of recognition, before returning to his call and disappearing back inside. Ethan told himself it meant nothing, that 2 years and a wheelchair and a beard could make a stranger out of anyone. But some quieter, more painful thought lingered beneath that explanation. The thought that, even if Mark had recognized him in that moment, he was no longer entirely certain his brother would have said anything at all. Robert Whitmore appeared on the terrace less than an hour later, older than Ethan remembered, his hair fully grey now, his walk slower, though his voice still carried the same authority it always had. He was speaking to a foreman about the wedding preparations scheduled for later that month, his attention fixed entirely on a clipboard in his hands. Ethan lowered his head instinctively as his father passed within a few feet of him, close enough that he could smell the same aftershave Robert had worn his entire life. For one aching second, Ethan almost spoke, almost let the truth spill out right there on the terrace, but Robert did not slow down. He glanced toward the grounds crew the way a man glances at furniture, present, useful, entirely unremarkable, and continued past without pausing. Ethan stood there afterward, gripping the handle of his gardening cart, absorbing something he had not expected to feel so sharply, the quiet, specific pain of being looked at by his own father and seen as no one at all. It was nearly evening by the time Ethan saw her. Sarah walked out onto the terrace, carrying a tray of lemonade for the grounds crew, a small gesture Ethan remembered his mother doing for workers years earlier, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of her doing the very same thing now. She moved down the line of hired workers, offering each of them a glass, with a warmth that had not changed in 2 years, the same warmth that once made Ethan feel like the luckiest man in Ohio. When she reached him, she paused only slightly longer than she had with the others, studying his face with an expression he could not quite read, something between recognition and confusion that never fully resolved itself. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly, nodding toward the faded unit patch still stitched onto his jacket. Ethan managed only a small nod in return, his throat too tight to trust with actual words. Diane noticed him the following afternoon, watching from the kitchen window as the grounds crew worked near the rose garden she had planted herself many years earlier. There was something about the way this particular worker moved, careful and deliberate despite the wheelchair, that tugged at a memory she could not quite place. She found herself standing at that window longer than she meant to, coffee going cold in her hands, unable to look away. When Robert asked what she was staring at, she only shook her head and said it was nothing, though the feeling followed her through the rest of the day, quiet and persistent, the way certain feelings do when the mind recognizes something the eyes have not yet confirmed. She did not mention it again that evening, but she found herself glancing out that same window twice more before the sun went down, searching for a face she could not stop thinking about. Later that week, while retrieving old permit documents for an upcoming inspection, Ethan found himself alone in the estate's business office for the first time, sent there briefly by a foreman to drop off a delivery. The office was Mark's now, his name printed on a brass plate beside the door, his desk cluttered with contracts and invoices Ethan did not recognize. It was only by accident, reaching to set down a folder, that Ethan's hand brushed against the bottom drawer, slightly ajar, revealing a corner of yellowed paper tucked beneath a stack of old receipts. Something about the handwriting visible on the envelope's edge made him stop entirely. He knew that handwriting. He had written it himself, 18 months earlier, in a hospital bed 6,000 miles from home, addressed to the one person he had trusted completely to still be waiting for him. Ethan stood frozen in that office for longer than he should have, his heart pounding against his ribs as he stared at the corner of paper peeking out from beneath his brother's invoices. He knew he should not touch it, should not risk being discovered rifling through Mark's desk, but his hand moved before his mind could stop it, sliding the drawer open just far enough to confirm what he already suspected. It was his letter, the one he had written to Sarah from that hospital bed, the one he had trusted the postal service and fate to deliver safely into her hands. The envelope had never been opened. It had simply been buried, deliberately, beneath 18 months of paperwork, hidden by the one person who should have carried it upstairs the moment it arrived. Ethan closed the drawer slowly, his hands trembling, understanding now, with absolute certainty, that his silence had not been the only thing standing between himself and the life he left behind. Walking back out to the grounds that afternoon, Ethan carried a weight far heavier than anything physical, the weight of finally understanding why Sarah had never written back, why the silence he assumed was distance had actually been something manufactured, something chosen. He thought of Mark's voice on that terrace, confident and easy, a man who had built an entire new version of himself out of the space Ethan's absence had created. He thought of his father passing him on the terrace without a second glance, and wondered now how much of that too had been shaped by choices made in his absence, choices he did not yet fully understand. For the first time since arriving back in Ohio, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Quiet, resolute anger settling in alongside the grief. A growing certainty that whatever kindness had once existed in this family, something else had been allowed to grow in its place while he was gone. It was Daniel who told him the rest, having overheard enough conversation among the estate's regular staff to piece together what Ethan needed to know. The wedding being prepared on the property, the one Ethan had seen mentioned on invitations and heard whispered about by the grounds crew, was Sarah's. She was marrying Daniel Price, the business associate her father had quietly encouraged for the better part of a year, in a ceremony scheduled to take place at the estate in less than 2 weeks. Ethan absorbed this information the way a man absorbs a physical blow, silently and without visible reaction, though something inside him had gone completely still. He thought of the letter buried in his brother's desk drawer, of the 18 months Sarah had spent believing he never wrote at all, and understood now that whatever happened next would have to happen before that wedding took place, not after. Ethan found himself hired on more permanently after that first week, brought in as part of the crew preparing the estate for the wedding itself, stringing lights along the garden pathways, setting up the very tent where Sarah would one day soon promise herself to another man. Every day on that property became a strange kind of penance, watching his family move through a life that had rebuilt itself entirely around his absence, watching his brother grow more comfortable in the role of the son who stayed. Ethan kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and let the beard and the wheelchair and the 2 years of change do the work of keeping him invisible. But invisibility, he was learning, came with its own quiet cruelty, the ability to watch everything and change nothing, to stand within arm's reach of the people he loved most and remain, to all of them, a complete stranger. It was Mark who first began to feel something was wrong, though he could not have said exactly what. He noticed the new groundskeeper more than he meant to, the careful way the man moved, something familiar in his posture that Mark could not place and did not want to examine too closely. When Daniel Reyes mentioned, casually, over coffee in the estate kitchen, that he had recently reconnected with an old friend from his army days, Mark's attention sharpened without his fully understanding why. He asked, too quickly, whether that friend had ever served with Ethan's unit. Daniel simply shrugged and said the army was a small world sometimes, and changed the subject. But the question lingered with Mark for the rest of that day, an itch he could not quite reach, a small crack of doubt opening in the confident version of himself he had spent 2 years building. Robert, too, found himself unsettled in ways he could not fully articulate, though his unease centered less on the new groundskeeper and more on his own son. He had begun reviewing older financial records ahead of the wedding, cross-referencing contracts from the period just after Ethan went missing, and found himself pausing over a handful of decisions that Mark had made quickly, decisions that had conveniently strengthened Mark's position within the company almost immediately after Ethan's disappearance. Robert told himself there was nothing sinister in ambition, that Mark had simply stepped up when the family needed him most, but some quiet, fatherly instinct kept pulling him back to those records anyway, kept him staring at dates and signatures a little longer than necessary, as though some part of him already sensed a story beneath the story he had been told. 2 nights before the wedding, Sarah found herself standing outside on the terrace long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, staring out at the same garden the groundskeepers had spent weeks preparing. She thought of Ethan more in that final stretch before her wedding than she had allowed herself to in over a year. Memories she had worked hard to set aside, now rising unbidden. His laugh, his promises, the ring she still had not been able to bring herself to remove from the small box in her nightstand. She told herself it was simply nerves, the natural uncertainty that came before any wedding. But some part of her, quiet and persistent, kept returning to the strange familiarity she had felt days earlier, looking into the eyes of a groundskeeper who had thanked her for a glass of lemonade, in a voice that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. With less than 24 hours remaining before the ceremony, the estate moved with the particular chaos that only a large wedding could produce. Caterers rushing across the lawn, florists arguing quietly over centerpiece placement, Robert pacing the terrace with his phone pressed to his ear, fielding calls from vendors and relatives alike. Ethan worked among the chaos in near silence, adjusting the final strings of lights along the pathway leading to the altar, close enough now to overhear fragments of conversation that confirmed everything Daniel had told him. Sarah's father, James Bennett, moved through the property with visible satisfaction, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, a man who had waited a long time to see this particular arrangement finally come together. Ethan listened to all of it, letter still fresh in his mind, and understood that whatever chance remained to change what was about to happen would have to be seized within hours, not days. Late that afternoon, while adjusting wiring beneath the reception tent, Ethan overheard a conversation between Mark and James Bennett that confirmed something he had only suspected until then. James was thanking Mark, quietly, for his discretion regarding certain matters over the past year, and Mark's response, low and clipped, made clear he understood exactly what James meant. Neither man spoke Ethan's name directly, but the implications settled over Ethan like ice water. His own brother had not simply found a letter and set it aside out of poor judgment. He had understood, at least in part, what its arrival might disrupt, and had chosen, along with Sarah's own father, to let that disruption remain buried. Ethan remained perfectly still beneath the tent structure until both men walked away, gripping a length of electrical cable so tightly his knuckles ached, forcing himself to wait, just a little longer, for the moment he had been building toward since that first night at the gate. That evening, Diane found the same groundskeeper again, alone near the rose garden, coiling hose beneath the last light of the day. Something about his stillness, his posture, the particular way he tilted his head when he noticed her approaching, finally pulled loose a memory she had been circling for over a week. "Have we met before?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended, almost hopeful, in a way she could not explain even to herself. Ethan looked up at his mother for a long moment, close enough now to see the lines that 2 years of grief had carved into her face, lines that had not been there when he left. He wanted, more than anything, to answer her honestly, right there in the fading light. Instead, he simply said, "Just doing my job, ma'am," and watched something flicker and fade behind his mother's eyes. Disappointment, mixed with a doubt she could not yet fully justify. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear and bright it seemed almost cruel. Sunlight pouring across the estate as staff scrambled through final preparations. Flowers arranged, chairs aligned, the altar dressed in white and gold beneath the reception tent. Ethan spent the early hours helping set the final rows of seating, watching guests begin to arrive in expensive cars, watching Robert greet old business partners with the same practiced warmth he had always carried. Somewhere upstairs, Sarah was being dressed by her mother and 2 bridesmaids, the ring Ethan had given her finally, reluctantly, removed and placed inside a drawer she promised herself she would deal with later. Ethan checked the letter one final time, still folded inside his jacket pocket, where he had kept it since the moment he removed it from his brother's desk, and understood that within the next few hours, every carefully maintained illusion on that property was about to come apart. By mid-morning, the estate had filled with nearly 200 guests, business partners of Robert's construction company, mingling beside old family friends who had known Ethan since childhood, none of them recognizing the bearded groundskeeper adjusting chairs near the back of the seating area. Ethan watched familiar faces pass within feet of him. Men who had once shaken his hand at company barbecues, women who had once brought casseroles to his mother's kitchen during difficult seasons, all of them entirely unaware that the man they believed dead was standing quietly among the hired help. Daniel Price arrived shortly after, dressed sharply, greeting guests with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted This day would arrive exactly as planned. Ethan studied him carefully for the first time, searching for some flaw, some visible reason Sarah might have chosen him, and found only an ordinary man benefiting from a series of choices that had never rightfully been his to make. Before the ceremony began, Robert gathered close friends and family for a small private toast inside the main house, raising a glass to Sarah and to the future she was building, careful, as he always was, not to mention the son, whose absence still occupied unspoken space in every family gathering. Ethan, standing just outside the open doors under the pretense of adjusting nearby lighting, listened to his father's voice catch slightly as he spoke of family and loyalty, of how proud he was of the choices his children had made in difficult times. Mark stood beside their father throughout the toast, accepting quiet nods of approval from relatives, fully settled now into the role of the son, who stayed, who built, who never left. Ethan felt something harden inside his chest as he listened. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but something closer to resolve, sharp and absolute. The final piece required before he could finally step forward. The ceremony began precisely on schedule, string music drifting across the lawn, as guests took their seats beneath the white reception tent. Sarah's bridesmaids walking the aisle, first in soft blue dresses. Ethan positioned himself near the back corner of the tent, ostensibly adjusting a final string of lights, close enough to see everything, far enough to remain unnoticed among the general bustle of wedding staff. When Sarah finally appeared at the top of the aisle on her father's arm, dressed in white, her face composed into the careful calm of a woman determined not to cry before her vows even began, Ethan felt the full weight of everything he had witnessed over the past 2 weeks settle heavily across his shoulders. James Bennett walked his daughter forward with visible pride, past rows of guests who had no idea what quiet arrangements had made this particular moment possible, past a groundskeeper standing perfectly still near the tent's edge, close enough now to reach the altar in a matter of seconds. The officiant began the ceremony with the familiar rhythm of words spoken at countless weddings before this one, welcoming guests, speaking of love and commitment, asking those gathered to bear witness to the union about to take place. Sarah stood facing Daniel Price with practiced composure, her hands folded carefully in front of her, though anyone looking closely might have noticed the slight tremor she could not quite still. Robert sat in the front row beside Diane, both of them watching, with expressions that mixed genuine happiness with something else neither could quite name, some lingering unease neither had found the words to voice aloud. Mark sat 2 rows back, his attention drifting occasionally toward the tent's edge, toward the groundskeeper still standing near the lighting equipment, that same nagging familiarity returning to him now stronger than it had all week. As the officiant reached the portion of the ceremony reserved for vows, Ethan felt the letter inside his jacket pocket and began, finally, to move forward. "Before you say your vows," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent tent, "I think there's something this family needs to hear first." Every head turned toward the back corner, toward the groundskeeper who had spent 2 weeks fading quietly into the background of estate life, now standing tall despite the wheelchair, his voice steady in a way that seemed entirely at odds with his appearance. Sarah turned first, her breath catching somewhere in her throat, some instinct older than recognition itself already registering what her mind had not yet allowed her to accept. Robert rose halfway from his seat, confusion crossing his face, while Mark went completely still 2 rows back, the color draining slowly from his cheeks as understanding finally arrived, too late to stop whatever was about to happen next. 200 guests sat in stunned silence, waiting as the man in the wheelchair began wheeling himself slowly up the center aisle. Diane was the first to say his name, rising from her seat with a hand pressed against her mouth, the word barely more than a whisper. "Ethan!" The single syllable seemed to echo across the tent, drawing gasps from guests who had known him for years, old friends who suddenly saw past the beard, past the weight loss, past 2 years of change, to the young man they remembered from countless family gatherings. Robert took 2 unsteady steps forward, his composure cracking entirely, tears already gathering in eyes that had not allowed themselves to cry in over a year. Sarah stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet slipping from fingers gone numb with shock, staring at the man she had believed dead for so long that grieving him had become easier than continuing to hope. Daniel Price simply stepped back, some part of him already understanding that whatever future he thought he had secured was no longer his to claim. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the folded, unopened envelope, holding it up for the entire gathering to see. "I wrote this to you 18 months ago," he said, looking directly at Sarah, his voice steady despite the tremor now visible in his hands. "I wrote it from a hospital bed, after I was told I might not walk again, because even then, the only thing I could think about was making sure you knew I was alive and still coming home to you." He turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward his brother, still frozen 2 rows back, unable to meet his eyes. This letter never reached her. It sat in a desk drawer for a year and a half, buried under paperwork, because somebody decided it was more convenient for me to stay missing. Gasps rippled through the crowd as understanding spread from guest to guest, the full shape of what had happened finally becoming clear. Every eye in the tent turned toward Mark, who remained seated, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edges of his chair as though bracing against a blow he had known, somewhere, was eventually coming. "I can explain," he started, his voice thinner than he intended, cracking slightly under the weight of 200 witnesses. But Robert was already moving toward him, his expression no longer confused, but sharp with a rising, controlled fury that silenced whatever excuse Mark had been preparing. "Explain what, exactly?" Robert said quietly, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear it clearly. "Explain why you let this family bury your brother while he was still alive and trying to come home." Mark opened his mouth again, but no words came, only a slow, defeated silence that told the gathered guests everything the letter had already confirmed. While the confrontation between Robert and Mark unfolded near the front rows, Sarah stepped down from the altar entirely, moving past Daniel Price without a single glance in his direction, her focus fixed entirely on the man now wheeling himself toward her down the center aisle. She stopped just short of him, both hands pressed against her mouth, tears finally breaking free as 2 years of grief and 1 final year of quiet, unexplained doubt collided all at once. "You're alive," she said, the words barely audible, more a realization spoken aloud than a question requiring an answer. Ethan reached up and took her hand gently, the same hand that had once worn his ring, and simply nodded, unable to trust his own voice with anything more. Around them, the wedding that had been meticulously planned for months, quietly, irreversibly, came apart, replaced by something far more complicated than anyone in that tent had arrived expecting to witness. As the tent dissolved into chaos, James Bennett remained near the front, his face pale, his earlier pride now replaced with something closer to shame. Robert turned toward him next, the pieces finally settling into place, the conversation Ethan had overheard beneath the reception tent now making painful sense in front of 200 witnesses. "You knew," Robert said, not as a question, but as a statement already confirmed. James did not deny it. He simply looked down at his daughter, standing hand in hand with a man he had spent a year convincing everyone was gone for good, and found he had no defense left worth offering. Daniel Price, still standing alone near the altar, quietly stepped further back from the gathering, understanding now that whatever role he had played, willingly or not, in a plan built on another man's presumed death, was not one he could easily explain his way out of either. Robert stood in the center of the aisle for a long moment, looking between his 2 sons, one who had crossed an ocean and endured injury and silence to make his way home, and one who had built a comfortable new life on the assumption he never would. He thought of the financial records he had reviewed just days earlier, The decisions that had conveniently strengthened Mark's position almost immediately after Ethan's disappearance. Decisions he had dismissed at the time as simple ambition. Standing there now, he understood how easily comfort could be mistaken for loyalty, how easily a family could convince itself that moving forward was the same thing as moving on. He reached for Ethan's shoulder, the same way he had the night his son shipped out for that final tour. Except now, the promise between them carried the full weight of everything that had nearly been lost in the 2 years since. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore family worked slowly to rebuild what nearly 2 years of silence and one deliberately buried letter had almost destroyed beyond repair. Mark stepped back from his role within the company, the trust that once came so easily between him and his father, requiring far more time to restore than it had taken to lose. Robert restructured the business to include Ethan properly, not as a replacement for the son who had stepped in during his absence, but as a partner rebuilding something the two of them could finally share honestly. Sarah's wedding to Daniel Price was quietly cancelled, and in its place, something far more private began to take shape. Conversations late into the evening, slow walks through the same garden where Ethan had once handed her lemonade as a stranger, the careful, patient work of finding their way back to each other. What happened at that wedding was never really about a soldier returning home in disguise, or even about the brother who chose convenience over honesty. It was about what happens when grief is left unexamined for too long, when families mistake silence for peace and comfort for loyalty, when the people closest to us make quiet decisions on our behalf that we never asked them to make. Ethan did not return home seeking revenge. He returned only wanting to understand who his family had become in his absence, and in doing so, uncovered a truth far more complicated than simple betrayal, one built slowly, decision by small decision, until an entire family had reshaped itself around an absence that was never actually permanent. Would you have recognized him? And if you were in Sarah's place, waiting years for a letter that never came, would you have known, somewhere, that the truth was still out there waiting to be found?